It's going to be okay.
I know, it's just hard.
I'm here for you, always.
Thank you. I love you.
I love you too.
Hello, family. Welcome to Threshtail Stories, where every story feels real. Please subscribe and leave a comment. It truly means a lot to us. Don't forget.
He built the life he always dreamed of. The career, the money, the respect that turned heads when he walked into a room, the kind of success people spend their entire lives chasing but never quite reaching. From the outside, it looked like the perfect story, the kind you tell your kids about hard work and perseverance, the kind people admire without ever asking what it really cost to get there. But behind every handshake, every promotion, every quiet celebration of his rising status, there was someone else whose name never made it into the story. Someone who stood in the background when there was nothing to celebrate, who stayed when things were uncertain, who believed in him long before anyone else ever did. And the truth is, none of it would have existed without her. Not the opportunities, not the confidence, not the version of himself the world came to respect. She was there when he had nothing, when his ideas were dismissed, when his future looked more like a question than a promise. She carried parts of his struggle that no one ever saw, made sacrifices that were never acknowledged, and built a foundation he would eventually stand on as if he had done it alone. And then, the moment everything finally came together, the moment his dreams turned into reality, the moment he no longer needed help to stand, he made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. He walked away. Not slowly, not with hesitation, but with a certainty that left no room for doubt. He chose someone else. And just like that, the years she had poured into his life were reduced to something that could be left behind. What happened next would not only reshape her world, it would unravel everything he thought he had built. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The truth about stories like this is that they rarely begin with betrayal. They begin with hope. They begin with two people who believe they are building something together, something lasting, something that will carry them through the uncertainties of life. And in the beginning, that's exactly what this was. He wasn't always the man people would later admire. There was a time when his future was uncertain, when his ambitions felt bigger than his circumstances, when the path forward wasn't clear and every step felt like a risk. Back then, his name was Daniel Carter, a man with ideas that rarely translated into results, a man who talked about success more than he experienced it, a man who needed someone to believe in him when he couldn't fully believe in himself. And that's where she came in. Her name was Emily Harper, and she was everything he wasn't at the time. Grounded, steady, the kind of person who didn't just talk about building a life, but quietly worked toward it every single day. She had her own goals, her own ambitions, her own version of success she was slowly shaping, but when their paths crossed, something shifted. She saw something in Daniel that others overlooked, not just potential, but possibility. And once she saw it, she couldn't ignore it. Their relationship didn't start with grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was simple, almost ordinary at first. Conversations that stretched longer than expected, shared ideas about the future, small moments that slowly built into something deeper. And before long, their lives became intertwined in a way that felt natural, almost inevitable. But what made their story different wasn't how it began. It was how much she gave once it did. Emily didn't just support Daniel emotionally. She invested in him in ways that would quietly shape the trajectory of his life. When his plans fell apart, she helped him rebuild. When opportunities slipped through his fingers, she encouraged him to keep reaching. When he doubted himself, she became the voice that reminded him of what he was capable of. And over time, that support turned into something much larger. She started making choices that prioritized his future over her own, taking on more responsibility so he could focus on his goals, adjusting her plans to align with his ambitions. Telling herself that the sacrifices were temporary, that one day it would all pay off, that they were building something together that would eventually belong to both of them. And for a while, it felt like that was exactly what was happening. Slowly but surely, things began to change for Daniel. The opportunities he had been chasing started to appear. The recognition he had been waiting for finally came. People began to see him differently, not as someone struggling to find his way, but as someone who had found it. And as his world expanded, so did the distance between who he used to be and who he was becoming. At first, the changes were subtle, Longer hours at work, new responsibilities, new people entering his life. Emily noticed it, but she understood. This was the life they had been working toward. This was the result of everything they had invested. But what she didn't realize was that the very success they had built together was slowly creating a version of Daniel that no longer saw her the same way. And by the time the truth finally revealed itself, it wouldn't be something that could be explained away or undone. It would be something that forced both of them to confront a reality neither of them had prepared for. Who was she really? That's the question most people never stop to ask when they hear a story like this. Because from the outside, Emily Harper looked like someone you could easily overlook. She wasn't loud about her sacrifices, she didn't demand recognition, and she never tried to position herself as the reason behind Daniel Carter's rise. She was simply there, steady and consistent, showing up in ways that didn't attract attention but made all the difference. The kind of presence that doesn't stand out until it's gone. And yet, if you look closely at the years before Daniel became the man everyone admired, you begin to notice something. Every major turning point in his life had her somewhere in the background. Every moment where he could have given up, where things could have fallen apart, she was there holding things together in ways no one else could see. She wasn't just part of his story. She was the structure that allowed it to exist. And that raises a deeper question, one that becomes impossible to ignore once you start connecting the pieces. Why would someone walk away from that? Why would someone leave behind the person who stood by them when there was nothing to gain, when there was no guarantee of success, when the future was uncertain and fragile? Because stories like this aren't just about love. They're about transformation, and sometimes the person who helps you become who you want to be is no longer the person you choose once you get there. But that still doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the timing, the sudden shift, the way Daniel didn't just distance himself emotionally, but made a clean break, as if he was stepping into an entirely new life. A life where Emily didn't seem to belong anymore. And then there's the question that changes how you see everything that comes next. Did he actually gain something by leaving her, or did he lose something far more valuable than he realized? Because on the surface, his decision might have looked like a step forward, a new relationship, a new environment, a new version of himself that aligned with the success he had worked so hard to achieve. But decisions like that have consequences that don't always reveal themselves immediately. Sometimes they take time. Sometimes they wait until everything else is in place before they begin to unfold. And when they do, they don't just affect one person. They reshape everything. What makes this story different is not just the betrayal, but what followed after it. The ripple effect that neither of them could have predicted, the way one decision set off a chain of events that would eventually force both Daniel and Emily to confront realities they had never imagined facing. Because this wasn't just about a relationship ending. It was about what happens when you build your entire life around something or someone, and then one day it's no longer there. It was about identity, about purpose, about the quiet cost of choices that seem justified in the moment, but carry a weight that only becomes clear later on. And as we move forward, the story begins to reveal something even more unsettling. That the moment Daniel thought he was stepping into a better life might have been the exact moment everything started to slip away in ways he couldn't yet see. Daniel Carter didn't start as the man people would later admire. Long before the tailored suits, the confident handshake, and the quiet authority he carried into every room. He was just another man trying to figure out where he fit in a world that didn't seem to notice him. He had ambition, there was no doubt about that. He talked about success often, about building something meaningful, about becoming someone people respected. But ambition without direction can feel like running in circles, and that's exactly where Daniel found himself. He moved from one idea to another, one opportunity to the next, never quite gaining traction. Jobs came and went, each one leaving him with more frustration than progress. There were moments when he believed he was close, when something almost worked, when it felt like things might finally turn in his favor, but those moments never lasted. Pressure began to build, not just from the outside but from within. The expectations he placed on himself became heavier with each passing year, and the gap between who he was and who he wanted to be started to feel impossible to close. He watched others move forward while he remained stuck, telling himself that his time would come, even as doubt quietly grew in the background. He had dreams, but no way to reach them. It was during this uncertain phase of his life that Emily Harper entered the picture. Unlike Daniel, Emily wasn't searching for direction. She already had it. She was grounded in a way that made her seem steady even when life became complicated, the kind of person who didn't need constant validation because she understood her own worth. She worked hard, not for recognition, but because it was simply who she was. There was a quiet confidence about her, not loud or attention-seeking, but deeply rooted. When she met Daniel, she saw beyond the surface that others dismissed. Where most people saw inconsistency, she saw potential. Where others saw someone who talked more than he accomplished, she saw someone who hadn't yet been given the right opportunity. And more importantly, she saw someone who needed someone to believe in him at a time when he was starting to lose belief in himself. She didn't try to change him overnight or push him into something he wasn't ready for. Instead, she stood beside him, offering support in ways that felt natural rather than forced. She listened when he spoke about his ideas, encouraged him when things didn't work out, and reminded him of his strengths when he started to question them. She didn't just see who he was, she saw who he could become. Their relationship didn't begin with grand declarations or dramatic moments. It started quietly, almost unexpectedly, through conversations that lasted longer than planned and small gestures that slowly built trust between them. Over time, that trust turned into something deeper. They began to imagine a future together, not in unrealistic terms, but in simple, meaningful ways. A stable life, a home they could call their own, a sense of security that came from knowing they were building something side by side. In those early days, everything felt possible. They supported each other, leaned on each other, and found comfort in the idea that they were moving forward together, even if progress was slow. Daniel began to find his footing, taking steps that once felt out of reach, while Emily continued to provide the stability that allowed those steps to happen. Their lives became intertwined, not just emotionally but practically, as they made decisions that reflected a shared vision of the future. But as time went on, something subtle began to shift. The same journey that brought them closer also started to change the balance between them in ways neither of them fully understood at the time. And while they continued to move forward together, building a life piece by piece, there was an underlying truth that had yet to reveal itself. But sometimes, the person who helps build your future isn't the one you choose to live it with. At some point, without any formal decision or clear conversation, the balance between Daniel Carter and Emily Harper began to shift. It didn't happen overnight. There was no single moment where everything changed. Instead, it unfolded gradually, through small choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but slowly redefined the foundation of their relationship. As Daniel continued searching for his breakthrough, Emily found herself stepping in more often, filling the gaps that his uncertainty created. What started as emotional support began to extend into practical sacrifice. She picked up extra hours at work, not because she had to, but because it gave Daniel more space to focus on his ambitions. Bills that were once shared became her responsibility more frequently, and expenses that should have been balanced quietly shifted onto her shoulders. At first, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like an investment. She believed in what they were building, believed that this phase was temporary, that one day the effort she was putting in would lead to something stable and lasting for both of them. But as time passed, those temporary sacrifices began to stretch into something more permanent. Emily started adjusting her own goals without fully realizing it. Opportunities she once considered began to feel less important compared to Daniel's progress. Plans she had for herself were postponed, then quietly forgotten, replaced by a new priority that revolved around his success. She told herself it was what partners do, that supporting each other sometimes meant carrying more weight when the other person needed it. And for a while, that belief kept everything in place. But the truth was, the scale had already tipped. The relationship was no longer balanced, even if it still appeared strong from the outside. The emotional weight she carried grew heavier, even as she continued to present herself as steady and composed. And somewhere along the way, without saying it out loud, she made a quiet shift in how she lived her life. She stopped asking what she wanted and started asking what he needed. While Emily was giving more of herself, Daniel's life began to change in ways that finally aligned with the vision he had always talked about. The opportunities that once seemed distant started to become real. He found himself in rooms he had never imagined entering, surrounded by people who recognized his potential and gave him the chance to prove it. His confidence grew with each step forward, and for the first time, he wasn't just talking about success, he was experiencing it. The momentum he had been chasing for years finally began to build, and with it came a new environment that introduced him to a different way of living. New colleagues, new expectations, new standards that reshaped how he saw himself and the world around him. It was everything he had worked toward, everything he and Emily had sacrificed to achieve. But success doesn't just elevate your circumstances, it changes your perspective. And slowly, that change began to create a distance between the life Daniel was stepping into and the life he had built with Emily. At first, the signs were easy to dismiss. Longer hours became part of his routine, justified by the demands of his growing responsibilities. Conversations that once flowed naturally started to feel shorter, more distracted. Time they used to spend together was replaced by meetings, events, and obligations that Emily wasn't always part of. She understood it on the surface. This was the price of progress, the cost of building something meaningful. But understanding it didn't make the distance any less real. The connection they once shared began to feel different, less present, less certain. Daniel wasn't pulling away in a way that was obvious or confrontational. It was quieter than that. A gradual shift in attention, in energy, in priorities. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself but becomes undeniable once you start paying attention. Emily noticed it, even if she didn't fully confront it yet. There was something different in the way he spoke, in the way he carried himself, in the way he seemed more connected to the world outside their relationship than the one they had built together. And as those small changes continued to add up, they began to point toward something neither of them had fully acknowledged. Because sometimes, the biggest turning points don't come from sudden decisions. They come from a series of subtle shifts that slowly lead you somewhere you never intended to go. And that's when everything began to change. As Daniel Carter stepped deeper into the life he had always wanted, the changes in him became harder to ignore, even if they were never directly addressed. What once felt like a shared journey now began to feel like two separate paths moving at different speeds. The man who used to sit with Emily Harper for hours, talking about possibilities and plans, now seemed constantly occupied, his attention pulled in directions she couldn't fully see. Late nights became more frequent. Often explained as necessary, unavoidable, part of the responsibility that came with his growing role. At first, Emily accepted it without question. She had been there through the struggle, so it made sense that she would also be there through the demands of success. But over time, the pattern started to feel different. It wasn't just the hours he was working, it was the way he returned home. Distracted, distant, sometimes barely present even when he was physically there. Conversations that once felt meaningful became shorter, more functional, as if something unspoken was standing between them. There were moments when she would try to reconnect, to bring back the sense of closeness they once had, but those attempts were often met with impatience or quiet frustration. Daniel wasn't openly cruel, but there was a shift in his tone, a subtle irritation that hadn't been there before. Small things began to bother him, things he used to overlook or even appreciate. The dynamic between them was changing, and while Emily could feel it, she struggled to define it. It wasn't one specific action or one clear decision, it was a collection of small changes that, when put together, painted a picture she didn't want to fully accept. The man who once relied on her for support now seemed less connected to her presence, and the more his world expanded, the more it felt like she was being left behind in a space that no longer fit the version of his life he was stepping into. Success didn't just change his life, it changed him. It was around this time that someone else entered the picture, though not in a way that immediately raised alarm. Her name wasn't something Emily heard often at first, just a passing mention here and there, someone Daniel worked with, someone who happened to be part of his new environment. Her name was Rachel Mitchell. She represented the world Daniel was now part of, confident, polished, fully immersed in the same space where he was building his future. At first, she was just another colleague, another name among many. But over time, the way Daniel spoke about her began to stand out in subtle ways. There was a certain energy in his voice, a level of attention that felt different from how he described others. It wasn't obvious enough to raise immediate concern, but it was noticeable enough to linger in Emily's thoughts. Rachel understood the version of Daniel that was emerging, the one shaped by success, ambition, and the environment he was now navigating. She saw him not as the man who struggled, but as the man who had already arrived. And in that space, she gave him something he hadn't been receiving in the same way at home anymore. Admiration that was immediate, effortless, and tied to who he was becoming rather than who he had been. The conversations they shared were different, centered around his current world, his achievements, his potential within that environment. It was a connection that didn't require explanation or history, and that made it feel easy. Emily, on the other hand, had been part of the process, the struggle, the foundation. But somewhere along the way, that history started to feel less aligned with the image Daniel was now building for himself. Emily began to notice the changes more clearly, even if she couldn't fully piece them together yet. The way Daniel checked his phone more often, the way certain conversations were cut short, the way his attention seemed divided even in moments that used to belong entirely to them. There was a growing sense that something was shifting beyond what she could see, something that wasn't being said out loud, but was present in the silence between them. She could feel the distance, even if she didn't yet understand its full cause, and while part of her wanted to confront it, to ask the questions that were forming in her mind, another part of her held back, hoping that what she was sensing wasn't what it seemed, because acknowledging it would mean facing a reality she wasn't ready for. She noticed the change, but she wasn't ready for the truth. The moment the truth revealed itself didn't come with a dramatic warning or a clear sign that something irreversible was about to happen. It arrived quietly, in the kind of ordinary moment that usually passes without consequence. Emily Harper wasn't searching for answers that day. She wasn't trying to confirm her suspicions or prove that something was wrong. In fact, a part of her was still holding on to the belief that whatever distance she felt could still be explained, still be fixed, still be something less than what her instincts were beginning to suggest. But reality has a way of presenting itself when you least expect it, and when it does, it rarely leaves room for denial. It happened through something simple, something almost insignificant on the surface. A phone left unattended for just a little too long, a message that appeared at the wrong moment, a detail that couldn't be dismissed or misunderstood. At first, it didn't fully register. Just a name, a few words, something that seemed incomplete without context. But then another message followed, and another, each one adding clarity in a way that felt impossible to ignore. The tone, the familiarity, the intimacy that existed between Daniel Carter and Rachel Mitchell was no longer something subtle or imagined. It was real, direct, undeniable. Emily didn't react immediately. There was no sudden confrontation, no raised voice, no dramatic scene. Instead, there was a stillness, a moment where everything seemed to slow down as the weight of what she was seeing settled in. The pieces she had been trying to ignore, the small changes she had noticed over time, all came together at once, forming a picture she could no longer look away from. This wasn't just emotional distance or stress from work. This was something else entirely. Something that had been developing without her knowledge, growing in the space that used to belong to them. And the hardest part wasn't just the realization that Daniel had connected with someone else. It was understanding what that connection meant. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness that could be explained away. It was something deeper, something that had replaced what they once had. The attention he used to give her, the admiration, the presence, it had shifted to someone else. It wasn't just betrayal, it was replacement. When Emily finally confronted him, it wasn't out of anger as much as it was out of a need for clarity. She needed to hear it from him, to understand how something that once felt so certain could have changed so completely. Daniel didn't deny it. There was no elaborate explanation, no attempt to reshape the truth into something less painful. If anything, his response was more unsettling because of how direct it was. He spoke about the changes in his life, about how things had evolved, about how he no longer felt the same connection he once did. He didn't frame it as something sudden, but as something that had been building over time. And in that explanation, there was a distance that Emily had never heard in his voice before. It was calm, almost detached, as if he had already processed the reality of the situation long before she even became aware of it. There was no visible struggle in his words, no hesitation that suggested he was unsure of his decision. And that was what made it so final. What followed wasn't a long, drawn-out ending. It was abrupt in a way that left no space for negotiation. Daniel made it clear that he was moving on, that the life he was stepping into no longer included her in the way it once did. The years they had spent building something together, the sacrifices she had made, the foundation she had helped create, none of it seemed to hold the weight it once did in his mind. There was no acknowledgement of what it had cost her, no reflection on what they had shared, beyond a simple recognition that it was over. He had already made his choice. And with that, he began to separate himself from the life they had built, not slowly, not with visible regret, but with a certainty that made it impossible to hold onto anything that remained. Emily watched it happen in real time. The person she had supported, believed in, and built a future around stepping away as if it were just another transition in his life. After everything she gave him, he walked away like it meant nothing. After Daniel Carter walked away, the silence that followed was heavier than anything Emily Harper had experienced before. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt peaceful or temporary. It was the kind that settles into every corner of your life, the kind that lingers long after the noise of what once filled it is gone. For years, her days had been structured around him, around his goals, his needs, his progress. Her routines, her decisions, even her sense of direction had been shaped by the life they were building together. And now, without warning, that structure was gone. What remained was a space she didn't recognize, a version of her life that felt unfamiliar in ways she couldn't immediately process. The absence wasn't just about Daniel not being there. It was about everything that disappeared with him. The shared plans, the expectations, the sense of purpose she had tied to their future. It all unraveled at once, leaving her in a place where even the simplest decisions felt uncertain. There was no clear path forward, because the one she had been following no longer existed. In the days that followed, Emily found herself moving through life in a way that felt disconnected, almost as if she were observing everything from a distance rather than fully experiencing it. The routines she once handled with ease now felt heavier, each task requiring more effort than it should. Conversations with others felt different, harder to engage in, as if there was a part of her that had withdrawn and hadn't yet returned. She wasn't just dealing with the loss of a relationship. She was confronting the loss of an identity she had spent years building. The version of herself that existed alongside Daniel, the one who had purpose in supporting, encouraging, and contributing to something bigger than herself, was no longer there. And without that, she was left trying to understand who she was on her own. It wasn't something that could be resolved quickly or easily. It required her to face questions she had avoided for a long time, questions about what she truly wanted, what she had given up, and what remained of the life she once envisioned for herself. Regret began to surface in ways she hadn't expected, not regret for loving him, but for how much of herself she had set aside in the process. Moments replayed in her mind, decisions she had made without hesitation at the time now taking on a different meaning. The opportunities she had postponed, the ambitions she had quietly let go of, the parts of her life that had been reshaped to fit into a future that no longer existed. It wasn't anger that defined those thoughts. It was a realization, one that came slowly but carried a weight that was difficult to ignore. She had built so much of her life around someone else's success that when that person left, there was very little left for her to stand on. And that realization didn't just hurt, it forced her to confront a truth she had never fully considered before. She didn't just lose him, she lost the version of herself she had built around him. Time moved forward, but it didn't feel like progress at first. It felt like endurance. Each day required her to navigate a reality that didn't match the one she had spent years preparing for. There were moments when the weight of it all felt overwhelming, when the idea of starting over seemed impossible, when the absence of what she once had felt too large to overcome. But even in that space, something began to shift, not in a way that was immediately visible, but in a way that slowly began to take hold beneath the surface. Because when everything is stripped away, when the life you built no longer exists in the way you expected, there is only one direction left to move: forward. And while Emily wasn't there yet, while she was still in the process of understanding what had happened and what it meant for her future, the foundation for that movement was beginning to form. It wasn't loud and it wasn't immediate, but it was there, waiting for the moment when she would be ready to see it. As Emily Harper was trying to piece her life back together, Daniel Carter was stepping fully into the new world he had chosen. From the outside, everything about his life appeared exactly the way he had once imagined it would be. The career he worked toward was now firmly established, his reputation growing among colleagues who respected his achievements and saw him as someone who had earned his place. And beside him was Rachel Mitchell, a woman who seemed to fit seamlessly into this new version of his life. She understood the pace, the expectations, the environment he now lived in. Their relationship, at least on the surface, looked effortless. They moved through the same circles, shared the same conversations, and operated within the same world that had once felt out of reach for Daniel. To anyone looking in, it made sense. It looked like a natural progression, as if everything had aligned exactly the way it was supposed to. Daniel embraced this new chapter without hesitation. There was a sense of validation in it, a feeling that he had finally arrived at the place he had been working toward for so long. The admiration he received, both professionally and personally, reinforced the belief that he had made the right decision. Rachel saw him as the successful man he had become, not the struggling version he used to be, and that perspective gave him a sense of confidence that felt new and reassuring. Their connection was built around the present, around who he was now, rather than the past he had worked so hard to move beyond. It was easy, uncomplicated in ways his previous relationship had gradually stopped feeling. There were no reminders of the years of uncertainty, no shared history of struggle that lingered in the background. Everything about it felt aligned with the life he believed he was meant to live. But over time, something began to surface beneath that sense of ease. It didn't happen all at once, and it wasn't immediately obvious. At first, it appeared in small moments, moments that didn't seem significant on their own, but slowly began to form a pattern. Conversations that felt slightly more forced than they once did, silences that lasted a little longer than expected, a subtle shift in the way Daniel experienced the life he had built. The excitement that once drove him began to feel different, less intense, less fulfilling than he had imagined it would be. The validation he had chased for so long no longer carried the same weight now that he had it. And while everything around him still reflected success, there was a growing sense that something wasn't as complete as he thought it would be. Rachel, in many ways, represented the life he had chosen, but she also reflected the limitations of that choice. Their relationship, built on shared environments and present success, lacked the depth that comes from having built something together from the beginning. There were no shared struggles, no history of overcoming challenges side by side, no foundation that extended beyond the version of life he was currently living. And while that hadn't mattered at first, it slowly began to create a distance that couldn't be ignored. The connection they shared started to feel surface level in ways Daniel hadn't anticipated, as if something essential was missing but couldn't easily be defined. At the same time, the pace of his new life continued to demand more from him. The responsibilities that came with his success didn't slow down, and the pressure to maintain everything he had built began to grow. What once felt like achievement now started to feel like expectation, something he had to constantly uphold rather than simply enjoy. And in those moments, when the noise of his new world quieted just enough for him to reflect, thoughts began to surface that he hadn't allowed himself to fully consider before. Memories of where he started, of who had been there during those early stages, of the foundation that had made everything possible. They weren't constant, but they were enough to create a sense of contrast between what he had now and what he had left behind. The life he thought he wanted wasn't what he expected. For a while, Daniel Carter tried to ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. He told himself that what he was experiencing was normal, that adjusting to a new level of success came with pressure, with expectations, with moments of uncertainty. He had worked too hard to question it now. Everything he had built, everything he had chosen, pointed toward a life that was supposed to be better than the one he left behind. And yet, the more time passed, the harder it became to dismiss the growing disconnect between what he had imagined and what he was actually living. It started with his work. The same career that once felt like a breakthrough began to shift in ways he hadn't anticipated. The environment became more demanding, less forgiving, and the sense of control he thought he had started to slip. Decisions that once worked in his favor began to face resistance. Relationships within his professional circle grew more complicated, less supportive than they first appeared. The confidence that carried him into this new phase of life began to feel less certain, replaced by a pressure to constantly prove that he belonged there. And when that pressure started to affect his performance, the cracks that had been forming quietly became harder to hide. Opportunities slowed, trust within his circle weakened. The stability he thought he had secured began to feel uncertain in ways he couldn't fully manage. At the same time, his relationship with Rachel Mitchell began to change. What once felt easy and aligned started to feel strained under the weight of everything else unfolding around him. The connection they shared, built on the present and the image of success, didn't hold the same strength when that image started to shift. Conversations became more tense, less understanding. The admiration that once came so naturally began to fade as the version of Daniel she had connected with no longer felt as solid as it once did. Without the shared history that could anchor them during difficult moments, the relationship began to lose its foundation. What was once effortless now required effort neither of them seemed fully willing to give. As both his professional life and personal relationship began to unravel, Daniel found himself in a position he hadn't considered when he made his decision to leave Emily Harper. The certainty he once felt was gone, replaced by a realization that the life he had chosen wasn't as stable as it appeared. And in that realization, something else began to surface. A recognition of what he had left behind, not just in terms of a relationship, but in terms of the support, the foundation, and the understanding that had once been a constant in his life. It wasn't a sudden realization, but a gradual one, built through moments where he found himself alone with thoughts he could no longer avoid. The distance between him and Rachel eventually became too significant to ignore. What once felt like alignment turned into disagreement, then into separation. The relationship that had replaced everything else in his life ended in a way that felt almost inevitable, leaving him with the same silence he had once created for someone else. And without that relationship, without the stability of his career, Daniel was left in a space he hadn't experienced in years. A space without direction, without certainty, without the structure he once relied on. And in that space, the truth became impossible to ignore. The moment he lost her was the moment everything started falling apart. While Daniel Carter was forced to confront the consequences of the life he chose, Emily Harper was quietly building something entirely different. Her progress didn't happen in dramatic moments or sudden breakthroughs. It began slowly, almost unnoticeable at first, through small decisions that gradually shifted the direction of her life. In the beginning, it was simply about getting through each day, learning how to exist without the structure she had relied on for so long. But over time, that survival began to turn into something more intentional. The questions she once avoided started to take on new meaning. What did she actually want for herself? What kind of life had she set aside, and what parts of it could still be reclaimed? These weren't easy questions to answer, but for the first time in years, they were hers to ask. Emily began to reconnect with parts of herself that had been placed on hold. Goals she once postponed slowly returned to her thoughts, no longer as distant ideas, but as possibilities she could begin to pursue again. She made decisions based on her own needs rather than someone else's, and with each choice, her sense of identity started to rebuild in a way that felt stronger and more grounded than before. It wasn't about replacing what she had lost. It was about creating something new, something that didn't depend on anyone else to exist. The confidence she developed during this time wasn't the kind that comes from external validation. It came from understanding her own value, independent of what she had given to someone else. There were moments when the past still surfaced, when memories of what she had shared with Daniel crossed her mind, but they no longer carried the same weight. They became part of her story rather than something that defined her present. And in that shift, there was a sense of clarity that hadn't been there before. She could see the full picture now, not just the love and the sacrifice, but the imbalance, the way she had shaped her life around someone else's journey at the expense of her own. That understanding didn't bring resentment. It brought perspective. It allowed her to move forward without needing closure from him, without needing answers that would no longer change anything. By the time Daniel found himself facing the reality of everything he had lost, Emily was no longer in the same place he had left her. She had already moved beyond it, not by forgetting what happened, but by growing through it. The life she was building now reflected who she truly was, not who she had become in response to someone else's needs. And that difference made all the difference. She wasn't waiting for anything or anyone to complete her story. She was writing it on her own terms. Sometimes, the greatest loss in your life is the lesson you needed to finally find yourself. What would you have done if you were in Emily Harper's position? When everything you believed in, everything you invested your time, your energy, and your future into suddenly disappeared, would you have stayed and tried to hold on to something that was already slipping away? Or would you have found the strength to walk away and rebuild your life from the ground up? These are the kinds of questions that don't have easy answers, because when you're in the moment, when emotions are involved, and history is attached to every decision, clarity isn't always there. It's easy to say what you would do from the outside, but living through it is something entirely different. And what about Daniel Carter? Do you think he truly understood what he lost when he made that choice, or did that realization only come after everything else began to fall apart? Because sometimes, understanding doesn't come when the decision is made. It comes later, when the consequences have already taken shape and there's no way to reverse them. Stories like this stay with us because they reflect real choices, real consequences, and the kind of moments that can define the direction of someone's life. There's no perfect outcome, no simple resolution that makes everything right again. There's only what each person does next, the way they respond to what they've lost, and what they choose to build moving forward. Emily Harper chose to rebuild, to find herself in a way she never had before. Daniel Carter was left to confront the weight of his decisions and the reality they created. And somewhere in between those two paths is a question that applies to anyone watching this. What do you value most when everything is on the line, and are you willing to protect it before it's too late? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you think, if it made you reflect on the choices we make and the impact they carry, subscribe for more real stories that reveal the truth behind success, relationships, and the decisions that can change everything.